Alright, so in this video we're going to talk about polar patterns of the microphones. That can be a little bit confusing, and there's a couple things we have to take into consideration. So basically, if you just look in Wikipedia, that, this is what they're showing you, which really isn't very descriptive of what's happening, because the microphone, like some condenser microphones, are basically, side shots. So where they call them side fire or side address, to where you're actually addressing the side, speaking into the microphone from the side. Whereas a lot of times you'll be dealing with some type of omnidirectional microphone that it'll be like a top fire, that you're speaking at it from the top. And does that make sense? And that's a real simple understanding of it. But it doesn't really explain it too well, visually for you to understand, so that you just look at these polar patterns and go, I understand exactly what that means. So, some of the things you have to take into consideration is the first thing you want to take into consideration is, let's say that this is a polar pattern, correct? These are polar patterns. And before we even get into it too much, that, they can be directly related to the frequency response that we've just been talking about. Because this polar pattern at 16 kilohertz, at 2 hertz, at 250 hertz, that, we talked about them testing the frequency response at, 1000 kilohertz. Well, it seems to have some type of a different polar pattern depending on the frequency. So what does that tell us immediately about the polar pattern? That immediately tells us that that polar pattern can be directly related, and is directly related, to the frequency response that we get when we're looking at a frequency response that they've tested with 2000 hertz. So we got this green polar pattern, so that's what we're thinking. Well, we're looking at the frequency response, and at 250 hertz, that it's different. It's got a different response, and so we're reading different levels. Does that make sense? At 0 degrees, it says it's 0. Well, but it doesn't seem to register the same way from different angles. So that is obviously one thing that, we need to take into consideration. As in most things, that, a lot of them haven't been tested from every angle with every frequency, doing a sine sweep, from every angle, so that we can understand all that stuff. So, basically we're always trying to deal with it from 0 degrees. And anything else in the polar pattern is catching what? Different things of acoustics, reflections and reverberations from the instrument or the room, the acoustics of the room. So that's something to take into consideration. The other thing to consider is, when you're looking at these polar patterns, is, okay, here's like, you're looking at what we had looked at on here, that we were looking at the polar patterns. And we're looking, what does that mean? It's showing us this diagram, but we don't really understand what that means by just looking at it. So here's a little bit better understanding, that it's showing you at 0 degrees in the envelope that's surrounding it. So this would be back towards the back of the microphone, and this polar pattern should be basically 360 degrees around it, with that type of pattern, that type of sensitivity. And that kind of helps us to understand that. And here's another look at like a condenser microphone, that, you can kind of see that same polar pattern. The problem is you've got things on the top, maybe or not, they're blocking the signal. So this is basically the side shot on the front and back, the sensitivity of it, but it's really hard to tell exactly how sensitive at what angle. So, like with most microphones, unless you're really getting, funny, that, you basically want to deal with it, from as direct as possible from wherever it comes. And, bidirectional microphones, the front and back, can be looking like this. So you have some understanding when that condenser microphone's sitting there and it's bidirectional, that's kind of be what the polar pattern looks like for that microphone. So that helps us to kind of understand what those are looking like as far as the polar patterns, so that when we're talking about what this is doing, that, are we talking about a side shot, something that you, like a condenser that you speak into from the side, or from the top, to where, when it's top and omnidirectional, what that means. So that gives us a little bit better understanding from looking at those, because, you know, that is a little bit more descriptive, so that you go look around on the internet or you're looking at microphones, that you've got a little bit better understanding when you see this polar pattern, whether it's side shot or top shot or what, you know, where the sound, it's assuming the sound's coming from. And we also understand when we look at this diagram and it starts showing this stuff, that what that means, you know, what direction the microphone facing. You know, this is like a dynamic microphone top shot, and we're seeing, you know, the response of it from the top. And if it was, you know, if it was like a condenser side shot microphone or something like that, it would be, you know, that whole polar pattern would be looked at a little bit differently. Does that make sense? Or these numbers would be out here telling us what that means, and seeing the polar pattern around that. So that kind of helps us a little bit. So when we start talking about this, now let's see what else they say about it. One thing before we go any farther on that is that when we were looking at these here, and we were looking at these pictures about frequency response, trying to keep in your mind that when we're looking at the frequency response at 0 degrees direct at where the microphone's facing, you know, to get the response, that's basically most of the time what we're looking at a frequency response. Does that make sense? And that microphone, the way it's designed, is going to pick up different frequencies at different levels, like we talked about. But the thing to keep in mind, this, if you didn't catch it, is that if coming at from different angles can have a serious impact on that. Okay, so far we got a pretty good understanding that if you set a decibel level that you send at the microphone to test it, that, you know, I mean, even if it's coming on straight on at 0 degrees, for whatever, you know, way the microphone is supposed to be facing for direction, that we understand a couple things. The first thing we do understand is that, you know, from the last video on frequency response, we understand that the levels that it reads it at are going to be different, you know, unless it's got a completely flat frequency response. So, I mean, that can be visualized on the actual polar pattern, but normally it isn't when we see that. We get that from frequency response. And the polar pattern is a set decibel level coming at the microphone from whatever direction it's facing or supposed to be used from at 0 degrees. And then we look around the polar pattern, how it's going to have a different level reading from different angles. So at different angles of the actual microphone, that it's going to register different SPL readings. And also we understand that we're going to get different frequency response from those different angles also. So more than likely that the frequency response that we get from a 0 degrees when they're testing it, that would be basically some related somewhat to different angles. Now, we don't know that for sure, and the answer to that is probably not. So, you know, really, whenever you're dealing with the microphone coming at from any other angle, my suggestion on that, unless you're really going to research the microphone a lot, that to not do that, because not only are the decibel levels going to be different, but the frequency response may be different. And we've already talked about that. So basically, whenever we're dealing with the polar patterns, we're trying to keep that microphone facing in the direction that it's supposed to be facing in as well as possible, so that we can use the polar pattern in the frequency response that we understand a little bit better now, as best we can. So we don't have to start trying to figure out what's happening with those volume decibel levels and the response of them with the polar pattern and the frequency response that we may be getting from not being at 0 degrees. So let's take another look at what they say in Wikipedia. So now we have a better understanding whenever we're looking at these, that the first thing we need to understand is what direction the microphone is supposed to be facing. That way, whenever we're looking at it, that it's omnidirectional, cardioid, subcardioid, bidirectional, hypercardioid, supercardioid, that we can apply these polar patterns to which way the microphone is supposed to be facing, so we can understand where 0 degrees is at head on into the microphone. That's a simple concept, and we understand that better now. And we also understand a little bit better about the polar pattern and what things might affect it. For the most part, I think we've addressed, most of these types of polar patterns. Omnidirectional, we understand from looking at that microphone what that means, basically 360 degrees. And the only thing we really need to take into consideration with that is the body of the microphone interfering possibly with that reception? So that has to be taken into consideration. Any one of these other polar patterns, whether it's applied to a dynamic microphone or a condenser microphone or any type of microphone, that polar pattern is pretty easy to understand now. Now we have some understanding what that means. And the basic understanding is, what's that polar pattern? From what we understand now, most all of them, that if you're at 0 degrees head on into the microphone, that you understand that how it's going to capture. And if you look at the frequency response, you got a pretty good understanding what the frequency response is going to be. So now with the polar pattern, what else might be affecting that? I mean, take the supercardioid, polar pattern here. What would be the point of that? Well, the only other point that really is pertinent is acoustics. So, like when we talked about, what a tom might be really just snap, really hit, fast, and there's not a whole lot of, acoustical things happening for very long afterwards. Whereas like a big tom or something is a little bit differently. Not only might it be reverberating on different parts of the instrument, depending on how far you put the microphone away from it or how close you put to it, but also the acoustics of the room, it rings out a lot longer and doesn't stop as fast. Does that make sense? And that's just a real quick example so that you can understand that actual polar pattern, how it's going to start accepting other, things from the actual impulse response of the room and the acoustics of the room and or environment. And that's going to be very pertinent, because that can be very pertinent in getting noise from the room, trying to capture the acoustics of the room, or trying to get, as little noise and distortion or sound from other instruments in the band, so that it's more, focused on whatever instrument that you're focused on without capturing too much of the stuff around you, or you really want to capture all the acoustics of the room. And that's basically going to be, what you're looking at. You're looking at a cardioid here, and it's pretty obvious if it's on a top fire that, it's really blocking anything underneath it, which, is not going to be that big of an issue. If it's side fire, anything in the back behind the vocalist, that that it's going to really cut off anything that's back behind there. It's not going to read it as well, and directly behind it, it's not going to hardly read it at all. So we've tried to address this in a very simple way, so that it didn't get too complicated, so that at this point, later on we might get into it a little bit more, just so that when we're looking at a polar pattern, we've got a pretty good understanding what they're talking about now. And after we looked around a little bit at it and dug around on the internet, that the basic concepts that we need to understand, I think we understand now, that way that we can apply that to a microphone. When we're looking at a microphone and that microphone has a cardioid polar pattern, we know exactly what that means. The only thing that we need to address at this point is we need to address, if it's top fire, side fire, things like that, to have an understanding of direction, so we know where 0 degrees is coming at that microphone to apply that polar pattern to it. Does that make sense? And we looked at certain three-dimensional pictures of that so we could have an understanding. The only other thing to take into consideration really with the polar patterns, for the basic understandings of it, is maybe things that are in the construction of the microphone, meaning some parts of the microphone might be interfering, causing diffraction, dissipation, and absorption, in the construction of the microphone itself. And if we get into things like dual membranes, where they've got one or more than one membrane for some reason, that for the actual type of the polar pattern. So that's going to get a little bit more complicated. But with the understanding that we have now, that we should be able to work through it fairly well with a pretty comprehensive understanding of what exactly it's trying to tell us. And applying that to the frequency response and being able to now understand how that's going to relate to impulse responses, that I think that we have a pretty good understanding of that. So that's a pretty basic general understanding of it, and I think that we've covered most pertinent basic aspects of it, and I think we're just going to set that aside for now and move on to the next subject. Peace, hope, love. See you in the next video.